Hi, this is Billy Huddleston, and I'm glad that you've decided to join me for our third Old Testament study of 2021. Remember, each month through this year, we're going to, on the second Friday of the month, we're going to spend a little bit of time in an Old Testament story, hoping to gain truth that we can apply in a new way today. And what I want to share with you tonight is something. There's no other way to say it. It's been convicting to me. And as I share it, it's safe to assume that many of you might feel convicted as well. And I think that's okay. Because through that conviction, the confrontation of the Spirit in our life, when we respond to Him, He does a work in us and makes us into the people He longs for us to be. And that's really what I want. And I believe the fact that you're here tonight shows that's what you want as well. Thank you for letting me know how you feel about these studies that we've been having. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, and I appreciate your input as well. 2 Samuel chapter 6 is where we're going to focus tonight. And 2 Samuel chapter 6, for many people, will be a familiar chapter of 2 Samuel. It's one of those chapters that has two main stories. And each of these stories are probably stories that you've looked at in Sunday school class, in youth group, in a Bible study, something of the sort. But these stories are connected with a little interlude that I believe causes us to have to look at the entire chapter as a whole in order to fully see the picture that's being painted. The first story is found in verse 1 all the way down through verse 10a, the first part of verse 10. And this is that story that we know it's common. It's the story of Uzzah and the ark. And then the second story is found in verses 12b, the latter part of verse 12, and it goes all the way down through verse 23. And this is the story where David, in his praise, in his excitement in God's presence, dances wildly before God. And that's an exciting thing. But what I want us to focus on in this story is David's wife, Michal. Now, I'll probably call her Michal because I'm Appalachian, but properly spoken, it's Michal. And then we watch verse 10b through 12a as a little interlude that I spoke of that will tie it all together. Now, when you come to 2 Samuel chapter 6, there's some things that we need to realize so we can have the proper context of the story. We know that it's at this point in time that David has ascended to the throne. It's almost as though what had been spoken by the prophet to his father many years before has finally been fulfilled. David is the king of all Israel. It's a united people now. It's not divided. And really what we see, especially as you work through 2 Samuel 5, different stories leading up to it, you see how David is the victorious conquering king. It's really exciting. And we see him, now that he's in his rightful place, he feels as though he needs to go and retrieve the Ark of God. Now, you're familiar with the Ark of the Covenant. It's the symbol of God's blessing and presence amongst His people in the Old Testament. It's where His presence was thought to dwell, there between the cherubim. And so it can be referred to it's often referred to in three different ways in Scripture. The Ark of God, as I referred to it, or the Ark of the Covenant, as it's commonly called. And so you use that too. And then the Ark of Testimony, because of what's inside, what God has done, the proofs of His goodness and His faithfulness to His people. And it's so significant to the people of God. It's not been in Jerusalem. It's not in its rightful place. And so now David, with him in his rightful place, he's going to go, and for the lack of a better way to say it, he's going to go and get God. He's going to go and get the presence, this symbol of God's blessing and presence amongst His people, and bring it to the city of David, bring it to Jerusalem, and put it in its rightful place as well. So we watch him as chapter 6 begins. He's gathers these great people, everybody with them. They make their way to the home of a guy named Abinadab, because this is where the ark has been residing. This is where it's been, and he's going to go and retrieve the ark. And I don't know how you approach scripture. I don't know if you pick up on little things, but I have found that the word of God is so descriptive. And if we'll just pay attention, we'll see things that can sometimes be humorous, can sometimes give us some input. It just really speaks. And when we see that they are going from Jerusalem to the home of Abinadab, my translation, I often use the New King James Version, says that Abinadab lived on a hill. It'll say that a number of times, and it really is important to get a hold of, especially when we see how the story begins to unfold. Now, you realize that if there's anything that can be said of God, is that God is a God of order. He's not a God of chaos. He's not a God of disorganization. God is a God of order. And you know that there are certain prescriptions that God has given his people in order to deal with certain things. And the holy things was one of those. And when you think about the transport of the Ark of the Covenant or the Ark of God, it was very specific. It was to be carried by a certain group of people, the Levites. They were the ones who God was their portion. They would serve God. They were, you could say, the priests, the ministers, the worshipers, all that kind of thing. It was to be carried by them by rods that would slip through the hoops or rings on the bottom of the ark on each side. They would lift the ark, place the rod on their shoulders, and they would carry the ark from place to place in that manner. That's how God said that the ark was to be transported. But on this occasion, in the excitement, it seems as though they've disregarded the prescription that God gave. Because what we find is the way that they are going to transport the ark is that they're going to place it on a new cart being pulled by an ox, driven by Abinadab's sons, Ahio and Uzzah. And you know, there's part of me that wants to say, at least it was a new ark. You know, it's not seconds, it's not the Chevette, and I'm not knocking a Chevette. Many of you know what that is. Some of you won't, but I drove a Chevette, so they were great cars, but they weren't Cadillacs. They weren't Lincolns. And so that's what we see here. This is the Cadillac. This is the Lincoln. It's a new cart being pulled by an ox by Uzzah and Ahio from their father's household, Abinadab's, who lived on a hill. And we know the geography of the area. Everything goes down to Jerusalem. So here, they're going to be driving the cart being pulled by an ox with the ark on the back. Do you see a problem with this? That's what I'm saying. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but that just paints a picture in my mind that perhaps, despite the fact that this was going against what God had said, that's the main point. But the fact that this probably isn't a good idea. And we see that everything is going along smoothly until they come to the threshing floor. And because of the nature of the threshing floor, the ox begins to stumble. And you can only imagine when the ox stumbles, the cart is going to pitch. When the cart pitches, when the ox stumbles, the ark is going to seem to be vulnerable. It's going to be unsteady. And as this all is taking place, we watch Uzzah. And you know, here's the thing. So many things come to my mind when I think about this story because, you know, this had been in their father's household, which means they had been around the ark. They had been in its presence. They had been around it, and I wonder how familiar they had become to it. The reason I say that is you realize tonight that there's a real danger in familiarity. The more familiar we become with a thing, the more common that thing becomes, and then it just kind of loses its otherness. The reason I say that, because when we watch the action unfolding, when we watch the ox begin to stumble and the cart begin to pitch and the ark seemingly become vulnerable and unsteady, this is where Uzzah does the unimaginable, the unthinkable, what he ought not do. He reaches his hand out to steady the ark. He places his hand on the ark of God, and in that moment, the anger of God is stirred, and God strikes Uzzah dead. He reaches out and touches the holy thing, and in that moment, the anger of God is stirred, and Uzzah loses his life like that. And something happens here with David. He gets angry. It's a powerful thing to see. He gets angry at God for striking Uzzah dead. And I'm just going to say this. He had no right to be. For one thing, remember, he is transporting the ark in a manner in which he should not be doing. He should have known better. His priests should have known better. The people who were with him should have known better, but they disregarded that. And besides that, God had been very clear about the prescription for these holy things for the ark. And he also was very clear of the penalty that would occur if someone were to break that prescription, or someone was to touch the ark. Numbers 4:15 says that if you touch the holy thing, the penalty will be death. So understand, it's easy for us to look and say, well, why in the world would God strike Uzzah dead? Maybe we should say, why wouldn't he? Because God is true to his word. And he had said that that would be the penalty. They knew this. But David got angry. He had no right. And let me just throw this out. I'm not going to throw a lot of commentary in, but I'm going to insert this in there. That's exactly what we do in our lives. We know the way God would have us to live as his children. How do we know? Because it's written in his word. It's not hidden. It's not veiled. It's written in his word. And yet so many of us think we can disregard his word, and then we get upset with him when things don't go the way we think they should. We have no right. David had no right. He's angry, but then something begins to happen. That anger turns to fear. See, where it seemed that God was vulnerable, you do realize God isn't vulnerable. Now David understands that they're the vulnerable ones. And in that vulnerability, fear overcomes David, and he begins to wonder, how can I finish what I started? I can't do it. So he aborts the mission. He abandons the ark at the home of Obed-Edom. That brings us into the interlude. Now, we're not going into great detail in these stories. We've got to go quickly, so go back and study it. But that brings us to the interlude where the ark is resting now at the household of Obed-Edom. And it doesn't stay there for a long span of time. 3 months is what the word says. 3 months. And you know that 3 months is a season. Winter, spring, summer, fall. And when you're younger, summer seems to last forever, but the older you get, it just kind of flies by. That's not a long span of time. But in those 3 months, what we see, because of the presence of the ark, because of the presence of God at the household of Obed-Edom, blessings begin to be poured out upon him and his household. It's not a whole lot of detail in this chapter about what those blessings were. And I think about those blessings, I would like to know what they were, because they were so great that the news of what God was doing began to spread. I mean, people in the city began to hear about how God was blessing the household of Obed-Edom. And then the news makes its way through the palace gates into the court of the king. And those people begin to hear what God is doing in the household of Obed-Edom. And then somehow the news reaches the ear of David, the king, and he hears about the blessings that God is pouring out. See, I want to know what those blessings were. Why? Because I want those blessings in my life. I want things to be so obvious that God is with me in my life, that people long for what I have, that they long for that same kind of relationship. I say that because when David hears about what's going on in the household of Obed-Edom, something begins to change within him. He comes to the conclusion, I've got to go and finish what I started. I've got to go to the home of Obed. I've got to go get God and bring him home. I've got to bring the ark of the testimony and put it in its rightful place. So we watch when the interlude ends and the second story begins, that's what's going on. David and the people, they make their way to the home of Obed-Edom. But there's something different this time than when he went to the home of Abinadab. There seems to be a change of posture, a different mindset, a different heart set, a humility perhaps that wasn't there before. Because when he begins the chapter going to the home of Obed-Edom, he seems as though he's the victorious, conquering king. He's disregarding what should have been, and he's doing things his way. And because of that, he pays the price. But Uzzah ultimately, because of what Uzzah does, pays the price as well. But on this occasion, there's a humility, because we watch even when they retrieve the ark, and it seems as though they're following the prescription that God had given. Because when they take 6 paces, is what the word says, they stop and they begin to worship. They offer sacrifices. They give offerings to their God. And when they do that, it seems as though everything breaks loose. Now, I'm not sure that everybody will appreciate what I mean when I say that everything breaks loose. Maybe you've been in a service before where the Spirit of God was so strong that people, they began to get obedient and things began to break loose. God began to move, and it was just one of those experiences that you never wanted to end. I mean, this is that point in time where we watch David dancing, you could say violently, dancing freely before his God. And people will say he was dancing naked before the Lord, but it tells us that he's wearing an ephod. And the ephod actually, if you want to look at this change of posture, the ephod, you remember who would wear the ephod? Samuel would, the priest would, and I'm not saying that that's the imagery that's meant, but it's also not kingly armor. I mean, it's probably his undergarment, his protective layer. He is whirling, leaping, dancing before his God, wearing only the ephod. And see, here's what's so interesting. You understand, he's come to the place where he has gotten so real with God that he has become vulnerable in his presence. I really believe it's a symbol that there's nothing hidden. We know that nothing is hidden from God, but here he recognizes that and he's dancing around. But in that vulnerability before God, necessarily, he is now vulnerable before the people as well. There are probably still those who would be loyal to the other king, to Saul's sons, to that. Probably those who would look for an opportunity to get rid of this king, to get rid of David. And if they wanted to do it, now would be the time. He has no protective layer. There is no mail. There is no armor. There is nothing protecting him. And now would be the time. He is vulnerable before the people in his worship of God, in his vulnerability before him. And see, let me put this in there again. I'm not going to stop on every little thing, but there's so much in this chapter. I really believe that this is why most of us never truly worship God. Because we are not willing to get real before him. We're uncomfortable being vulnerable before him, because as we become real before him, we have to be real with one another. Or you could say, in our vulnerability to God, we necessarily become vulnerable to one another. And we don't like that. We're too concerned about what someone else might think. We're too concerned about what someone else might say. But here's the thing. Oh, the freedom that would come, the change of our gatherings if we were just real with him and one another. When we got to the point where we were more concerned about what God thought than caring about what others may think. When we're more consumed in his position, who he is, than worried about ours and who we think we are, things can really begin to happen. That's when things break loose. Everybody's celebrating. As they're making their way into the city, they proceed through the city gates. Everybody's involved in this worship. Everybody but her. Scriptures say that in the palace, I like to think in the tower, if you were to look in the window, there's a set of eyes looking down on what's going on. And that imagery is so powerful to me because I've met so many people over the 24 years that I've traveled who like to look down on the things that are going on. They like to look down on the way people choose to worship. They like to look down on the way that people respond to God's presence. And that's what she's doing. She's looking down. Her arms are folded as she sees her husband, the King of Israel. And I guess this is the time that we need to meet her. Her name is Michal. And every time you read her name in this story, it always says Michal, the daughter of Saul. It doesn't say Michal, the wife, the first wife of David. That's who she is. But it always ties her to Saul. So we know just from that she was a princess. We know that she had been raised in the palace. We know that she knew the etiquette. She knew how a king should act, how a king should respond, because she was the king's daughter. We don't really know a whole lot about her, but she does appear 17 times in the scriptures. And those 17 times are found in the total of 8 verses. And from those verses, we learn that she is the youngest of 5 children of King Saul. Not only is she the youngest of 5 children, but she is the youngest of 2 daughters that Saul had. And you know that kings and queens wanted heirs. They wanted male children. And if they had a daughter, that daughter would often be used as a tool to forge alliances, to do things like that, to ensure their reign, to ensure the king's kingdom. And so we watch in 1 Samuel chapter 18 that Saul is going to do this. He's going to use his youngest daughter as a way to get rid of this guy named David, who at this point, even at 1 Samuel chapter 18, was beginning to become a thorn in Saul's, at least Saul was being insecure and was being a thorn, it seemed, in his flesh. And so in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, Saul arranges that Michal will marry David. But you'll recall in the story, the bride price would be what David would have to give in order for her hand in marriage is the foreskins of 100 Philistines. You know why he did that? Because he thought there's no way that can happen. The Philistines, who are ruthless people, will kill David. But David got double that. And so we watch that he marries Michal. It's really incredible. And there's a beauty to it at first. Because in 1 Samuel 18, verses 20 and 28, we read that Michal loved David. Now, it's kind of powerful that I'm aware of. We don't read that David loved Michal. But it does say twice that Michal loved David. And we see that love displayed as well. Because remember, it was she who helped him escape her father's murderous plot for her husband. He was going to send his men to kill David as they were asleep in their bed. But Michal learns about this, helps David escape by luring him through the window. And by doing that, he's able to flee and get away from Saul's men. Time passes, and we see that there's separation, there's communication for a while, different battles are going on. I mean, the drama is really playing out. And over time, we see that Saul, really in an underhanded way, decides to marry his daughter off to Paltiel, or I'll just call him Paltai, another man. Now, she was already married to David, but we see that Paltai now becomes her husband. Long story short, Saul eventually dies. The death of Saul occurs. And in that, as David is dealing with Abner, different things like that, the deal is made that Michal will come back to him. He sends for his first wife. And read it sometime. It's 2 Samuel chapter 3. And then in verses 15 and 16, there's this interesting scene. Now, you never read that David loved Michal. But it seems that Paltiel or Paltai, I don't know how to say these names, but anyhow, it seems that he loved her because he follows behind. It's such an odd picture. Weeping over his wife who's being taken from her. Perhaps she found love. Perhaps she found contentment, but now she's back in the palace, back doing her duty, being the queen of these people. Her life hasn't been easy. She's been used. And now she looks down and she sees her husband, the one that ascended from a shepherd's field to the throne of Israel. He's leaping and whirling. And this is what Scripture says. Let me find where it says it. It's verse 16, the last phrase. She despised him, speaking of David, in her heart. This was the man she once loved. It says it twice. It's displayed in how she risks her life to save his. And now she despises. Let me throw this out there. I told you her life isn't easy. She's been used. And I'm going to tell you, life isn't easy. Some of us are used from time to time. We feel used. We feel betrayed. We get hurt. Even in church, we get hurt. But I'm going to warn you based upon this story. Guard your heart. Do not allow what has happened to you to cause you to become bitter. Because bitterness will destroy you. It will be your downfall. Be careful, please. Be careful. It's not worth it. Well, if you knew what he did to me so many years ago, I know it hurt. But stop living in the past and allow Jesus to do a work in your life that will set you free from that hurt. Don't become bitter. It will destroy you. It's what happens to her. She despises when she sees his worship, when she sees him whirling and dancing around in his ephod. She despises him in her heart. So as the story proceeds, we watch in verse 17 and 18 the worship as David places the ark in its rightful place. God is now in his rightful place. And we see that with the ark in its proper place, David now, and this is where I want you to focus on some of the verses, David now begins to bless the people. He's offered the sacrifices, burnt offerings, peace offerings, the word says. And then we read that he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Now watch verse 19, and I want you to pay a special attention, close attention, to the inclusive language of what's going on here. The inclusive language in verse 19. Then David distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. Depending on which language you want to count, there's at least 5, really 6, but 4 or 5 references of everyone receiving a blessing. David blesses all. Everyone receives, both men and women. Why is that important? Because I want you to see this picture. Oh, if we could get a hold of this. When God is in his rightful place, everybody benefits. Everybody's blessed when God is in his rightful place. So I wonder what that means. I wonder, Dad, what would happen if God was in his proper place in our home? Mom, I wonder what would happen in our workplace. I wonder what would happen in our churches. Everybody is blessed because the ark is in its proper place. When God is in his rightful place, everybody benefits. So having blessed everybody in verse 19, verse 20 reads, then David returned to bless his household. So here's the picture. Everybody has been blessed. Now David is going to carry the blessing to his household. Having blessed everyone else, he's going to carry that blessing to his own house. But notice the action. Before he ever gets in the door, it says, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. So the image is, having blessed everybody else, David now is going to carry the blessing into his own household. But before he ever gets through the threshold, before he ever walks through the front door, Michal comes out and stops the blessing. Wow. Everybody has benefited. Everybody's been blessed. So David's going to carry that blessing into his own household. But before he ever gets through the front door, Michal comes out and stops the blessing. I wonder how many times I've been guilty of stopping what God has wanted to do, because it didn't meet my expectation, because it didn't look or sound the way I thought it should, because my preference was more important than his presence. I wonder how many times I have stopped the blessing. Do you realize this should show us that we need to understand we have a great responsibility, not only personally, but corporately, because we can stop the blessing. We can hinder what God is doing, as well as receive it. And we see her. It's so obvious. And I could stay here a long time, but I'm not going to. But she stops the blessing. Oh, God, help us never to be responsible for stopping or hindering what he wants to do in our midst. So there's a conversation. We'll just read it real quickly and just think of a husband and wife bickering. She says to David, how glorious was the king of Israel today? And remember, this is sarcasm, because in her mind, this is anything but glorious. How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself in the eyes of the maids of his servants. Do you sense some jealousy there? Do you sense some hurt from the past? I mean, all that kind of thing. Maids of his servants as one. And here's the real issue. As one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Why is that the real issue? Because remember, she grew up in the palace. She knows the etiquette. She's been raised there. David was a shepherd. And let's just cut to it. You can't get any more base than a shepherd. She's saying, you're acting like a commoner. Yeah, you're some king. You're not a shepherd anymore, David. You really showed yourself just like a base fellow. So David is going to get his jabs in as well. He says, it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this. It's almost as though, as you can hear him say, I'll dance naked if I want to. I'll be more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor. And this is what I want you to see. This is where we need to receive the warning. We need to take an honest inspection of our lives. Verse 23. Therefore. And you realize that's a connecting word. I won't take, I don't like cliche. I don't like old silly sayings, but you remember People have said before, when you run across a therefore, you need to ask what it's there for. As silly as that is, it's true, because this is a connecting word. And when we read that therefore, it tells us because of what we have seen, because of what we have looked at together, because of what we've read, this is the result. Therefore, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Therefore, because of what we saw, Michal was barren. She did not produce life to the day of her death. And you say, well, what's the big deal? In a day, seriously, of Code Pink, maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal, but in this hour, for a queen, for a woman, but for a queen not to produce an heir, male children, not even bargaining chips, female, it was disgraceful. It was viewed as God was punishing. He had removed his hand of blessing. And let's be honest about this. The language, many times, because of tenses and language, you can tell what caused the action. And we can't say that God closed her womb. It could have been, we know that he could have, but it could simply be that David didn't visit her in the marriage bed anymore. Whatever it may be, life was not produced. Why is this important? I started going to the church that I'm a part of, the Church of the Nazarene, when I was 15 years old because a girl asked me to go. I went there, and there was an enthusiasm about those people. There was an excitement in their worship. There was an expectation when they gathered together. And when I didn't get the girl, I wanted what those people had. That was back in 1987. Had it not been for that experience, I don't know where I would be tonight or now. I honestly don't. I likely would have never gone to the Church of the Nazarene. I likely would not be an evangelist. I wouldn't be preaching and singing, all those sorts of things. I don't know where I'd be. But it happened because I knew I wanted what those people had. Now, when you jump ahead to 2021, most places I go to, I'm in a different place. Outside of COVID, 2020 is a lost year. It's so weird, but it's the same for you. I go to places, I'm in a different place every week, all throughout the year. Churches, camp meetings, special services. And I'm afraid most places I go, had I gone as a 15-year-old boy because a girl asked me to go, and when I didn't get the girl, I'm afraid that there'd be nothing about those people or that place that would make me want to stay. There's not an excitement, there's a drudgery. There's not an expectation. Instead, there's an attitude of let's just do what we've got to do and get on with our lives. There's not an urgency to share the love of Jesus with people who walk in off the street, probably because they're not walking in off the street. Life isn't being produced. People aren't being converted. They're not being saved. They're certainly not being sanctified. And I know in the holiness movement, we talk about entire sanctification, and God can do those things. And I hear many people saying, well, we're just not preaching a second definite work. And the problem is, you can't have a second work if you never have the first. Our churches have become barren. There's no production of life. There's no reproducing. We just want to stand back and fold our arms. And because of that, we don't produce life. There's no signs of life. we're barren. Instead of being filled with the Spirit of God, we've been overcome by the spirit of Michael. And until we are delivered from that critical, that harsh, that lifeless spirit, we'll never be the people that God intends for us to be. So I wonder, this is one of those times where you got to watch what you say, because this is out there. This is going to be, I wonder what spirit controls you, because it's easy to look around at other people, but you know what? We've got to grow up. We've got to get beyond that. We can't control anybody else. All we control is ourselves. Are you producing life? Don't blame your pastor for your church not growing if you're not willing to produce life, because he's the shepherd, you're the sheep. Sheep make sheep. Shepherds don't. Does the Spirit of Christ flow through you, or are you overcome by the spirit of Michael? God help us to get real. God help us to do whatever it takes so that life could spring forth again. Well, that got kind of heavy, but I told you it was going to be. It's a very relevant word for our day. Critical word, I believe, a convicting word, but if we would respond positively to that conviction, it would be a life-changing word as well. And that's what I hope. Some new truth for today from the old. Well, you've been patient with me. I've gone a little bit longer, but we had a lot to cover. So please join me next month, second Friday, where we'll look at another Old Testament story. Again, this is Billy Huddleston. So glad that you're a part. Be sure to check out my website, see if I'm going to be in your area, and if so, come and see me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.